Welcome back to the interview series on the socio-economic consequences of disruptive technologies by Rethinking Economics NL. Today, we'll be focusing on science, technology, innovation, or STI policies, especially in the context of sub-Saharan Africa and different perspectives on evolutionary economics. For this, I'm honored to be able to introduce 4 world-class experts on these fascinating topics. Firstly with us today is Chux Daniels, who is a research fellow at the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, United Kingdom. He joined the University of Sussex in 2011. In addition to research on teaching on STI policies, digitalization, and public policies, he supervises doctoral researchers and Bachelor of Science students. He is the director of the Transformative Innovation Policy, TIP Africa Hub, a research program that involves Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, South Africa, and other countries from the Southern African Development Community region. Alongside research and teaching, Chux is also involved in active STI policy work. Secondly with us today is Susan Newman, who is a professor and head of economics at the Open University in the United Kingdom. She previously held positions at the University of West of England, the International Institute of Social Studies Erasmus University of Rotterdam, and the University of Witwatersrand. He is also a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg and an affiliate of the Centre on Labour and Global Production at the Queen's Mary University of London. Susan completed her PhD, titled Future Markets of Coffee Prices, at the School of Oriental and African Studies in 2009. Her research interests include the political economy of industrial development, the relationship between finance and production, and the social relations of production and exchange in the agro-food commodity chains. Thirdly with us today is Nathalie Lazaric, a research professor in economics at the French National Centre for Scientific Research, CNRS, and the president of the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy. She's also an editor of the Review of Evolutionary Political Economy and advisory editor of the Evolutionary Political of the Journal of Evolutionary Economics. She holds a PhD from the Technological University of Compiègne and a habilitation from Strasbourg University. Besides her research and innovation from an evolutionary political perspective, she also has focused on energy consumption and sustainability issues, related to which she has been involved in several national and European projects. Lastly with us today is Verónica Robert, who is an adjunct researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina, and director of the Center for Developmental Economic Studies at the Interdisciplinary School of Advanced Social Studies at the National University of General San Martin. She studies innovation systems in developing countries from a neo-schumpétérienne evolutionary perspective, and the relationship between technology, product specialization, and economic development. Her research interests cover innovation, technological change, and economic development. She's also a lecturer at the undergraduate and postgraduate level at the National University of General San Martin and the National University of General Sarmiento. She obtained her PhD in economics from the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And the first question of the day is for Dr. Daniels. Could you tell us more about science, technology, innovation policy, or STI policy, in the context of sub-Saharan Africa?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for today. I'm in a new location, so I've been trying to get my lighting to work, but it doesn't seem to be the best anyway. But yes, thank you. This is very important. When I got the message, I was like, okay, this is good. We've been doing a lot more to try to engage economics and science and technology politics. So that connection is very important. I'll say a little bit more about it later. But STI policy, or STIP, I'll just abbreviate it for time. I know we have a short time. It has been acknowledged very strongly in the African continent as an important driver for economic development and transformation. There's a big transformation agenda, the Agenda 2063 of the continent, and then based on that, there are 10-year strategies developed on top of that to kind of help unpack the 50-year plan, which is the Agenda 2063. One of that 10-year strategies called TISA, the STI Strategy for Africa 2024. There is also the CISA, the education component. However, the goal is to try to use to convert for Africa to move into a knowledge-based economy. So STISA supports that. So at the continental level, we have that very strong recognition, which is great. At the regional level, we also have the regional economic communities, six or seven of them, ECOWAS being one, SADC being another, for example, and then we have COMESA another, so long abbreviations, sorry, SADC being the Southern African Development Commission, ECOWAS being the Economic Community of West African State, so each region has one. Now we also have policies at that level. That's the point I'm trying to head to, looking at STI again. So for SADC, there's a framework. For the ECOWAS, there is ECOPOST, ECOWAS policy on science and technology. So again, there is recognition. And then we come to the national levels, we have many policies as well. So almost all African countries now have S&T policy, science and technology policy, or STI policy, except a few, which is about 90-something%. The ones who don't have, like Senegal, they still have programs to implement programs and initiatives that speak to research and innovation and R&D and S&T, although they don't have a formal policy. So that is fine on that level. However, what we see, so what I've just explained is there's a lot of formulation. We have many policy documents across the continent, so there's no problem at all there. Where there are problems, once you get to that level and you go past that using the policy cycle as a frame, you begin to see many challenges and difficulties in implementation, massive problems. So many of these nice written policies, including STISA 2024, are struggling with the implementation or not being implemented at all, or very low implementation at the continental level, at the regional level, also at the national level. We were in a meeting where one of the country STI policy director was saying their STI policy was implemented only 5%. I don't know how she got the 5%, but the key point is that there is no implementation happening. There's also issues around governance. There's also issues around the evaluation and the monitoring. So these are the areas where the difficulties are. So why are some of these difficulties? Funding, for example, issues around capability. 1980 Lagos Plan, which is 1980, close to 40 years, the continent agreed or committed to commit 1% of the GDP on R&D. We know research and development is very critical for innovation. It's not the only factor, but it's important. But up till now, maybe one or two countries, 40 years, have hit that record of 1%. There are still many of the countries at the level below the 0.5% mark. So these are the kind of issues. So beyond just the funding, it demonstrates commitment. So you formulate these policies, but then the financial commitment, the resources, the governance infrastructure, the actors' engagement, those companies, bring in. Now, this links to economics because they're recognizing on one point that STI policy is important for economic development, but then the STI policy that needs to drive the economic development is not well supported. So we have tension, either we're rethinking the economic model or we're rethinking the STI policy model or the way the interactions among them. However, just taking it forward again, then we have this new dimension where we have the SDGs, where we're not just looking at economics or STI as separate unit, we're looking at them together in a systems approach. We're looking at how do they connect together. So how do we use STI policy to address the SDGs? One of the SDG being economic growth and reduction of poverty and development, but also infrastructure and innovation. So they're connected. Again, so there is this tension where we have STI policies being acknowledged, but not well being supported or implemented. And then whereas we're also expecting the same STI policy to achieve many of these objectives, to help create jobs, to help do this. So there's a huge expectation on STI. If you look at innovation, for example, where we focus on, there is the definition, the understanding, the conceptualization of innovation. There's a whole range of work we're trying to do on that, how innovation is understood. So I know that colleagues need to come in, but let me just end again with one point that there is a huge massive awareness now, acknowledgement that STI policy is important, is useful, it needs to be encouraged. However, the next steps are where we have in many of the difficulties. So many of the countries have started, many of them have even have the next or second versions of the STI policy, which is a formulated one and then revised. And then the role of innovation is still a bit difficult in the STI. We have more S, more research, more higher education policy, more S, less of the T, and even far less the I. So if you S is here, T is here, maybe I is like that in many of the policies. So understanding of really where innovation plays a role, and we're trying to work with them to focus on the innovation component in terms of, because this is where a lot of the transformation we see is going to happen more. So the higher education, okay, doing well on the S side. The T is also improving now, with a lot of the digital technology work happening and the infrastructure and investment happening there. But innovation components still really, really struggling in terms of the way it's conceptualized, the way it's promoted, the way it's rewarded, the way it's incentivized, but also the way the policies for innovation or innovation to support policies are working. So then we come into really then using STI to be able to address the SDGs, which is the transformative change and the work we're doing. The ID thinking is quite still new to many of the countries we're working with, but many of them have signed up. Again, in the TIP work we're doing, transformative innovation policy. How do you use innovation for transformation, which is a real concept, and then which is using innovation to address the SDG goals. So yes, there are many goods, there are many positive on many fronts. Many of them have ministries of STI or Ministry of Science and Technology. We have all those infrastructure, but we see, I've mentioned implementation, evaluation, and governance issues are really where the bottlenecks are. Governance in terms of the structures to enable that. And then all of this is embedded within economic growth, because one of the reasons some of the countries are not so keen on the SDGs is because they're looking at, okay, if we focus too much on climate or focus too much on X, it's going to reduce economic growth for us. And we have young people, we have population growing, we have to create jobs. And so there is this tension between, do we go the Chinese model, or do we go the European model, or do we go this model? So again, how we position STI within those political economy context and tensions becomes a real issue we're dealing with. Thank you. Is that enough for now?
Yes, I think it's a beautiful overview. I think it's a beautiful overview of what's going on there, and also the tensions and opportunities that arise from it. And for Professor Newman, I saw you nod already a few times, and I was very curious on how this relates to your research, and especially the opportunities and tensions related to development, financialization, and of course neoliberalism in the context of sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I'm the one person here who's not an expert in innovation or science and technology. So please excuse me for any naive approaches. But I think the first question I have as a development economist is often to have a look at the structure of the economy. What is the nature of economic activities and how is that organized? You know, how are people employed? So that's the first thing I'd look at. And if I was interested in how science technology policies might interact with that, that's where I would try and understand the linkages. The second thing to note is that actually in sub-Saharan Africa is highly uneven, even within certain economies, the scientific endeavor, discovery, and then what's happening economically. South Africa is a case in point where you have really sort of leading scientific research and innovation, side by side with high levels of unemployment, poverty, and it's still very sort of in many ways underdeveloped economic, sort of underdeveloped precarious labor, underemployment, and the like. So that was one point I want to make. The second point I wanted to make was really, if we look at the nature of sub-Saharan African economies today, barring South Africa, Lesotho, and Swaziland, all these economies are reliant on primary commodity exports. So these are still export-dependent economies. So it's really important, I think, to really understand how science and technology can engage at this level and this sectoral level, and how that can promote much wider economic development to link into the rest of the economy in order to promote sustainable, equitable economic development. And when we think about things like commodities, the next thing we have to think about is who controls the international trade of those commodities. And here we're looking at the international traders and the major buyers, and what's happening to these in this case, right? So one aspect of that, which you've mentioned already, is financialization. So financialization refers to many different things, but one way to understand it is in relation to corporate strategy and corporate restructuring. I think a really simple way of thinking about it is a way in which Milberg and Winkler term the changing sources and uses of profits. So what we see with financialization, particularly at this like kind of international trader level or these international corporations, the multinationals that are able to really control the trade in primary commodities, is that with increasing outsourcing, arm's length relations, etc., they've really squeezed suppliers in a way that means suppliers are unable to really engage in real kind of upgrade and technological upgrading that is meaningful, right? So this is, I mean, there are of course exceptions, but this is quite clear in a number of areas. So I think we need those sorts of power relations really need to be taken into account when we think about how sub-Saharan African countries in particular can benefit from certain science technology policies that are embedded in the nature of economic organization in these economies. I think probably the last thing I'm going to say, because I really want to hear what the actual experts have to say about these ideas, is really, I think, is the redrafting of industrial policy. So understanding industrial policy is more than any one thing. So it's not just macro policy or innovation policy, but really it needs to be understood as a complex of activities with really working relations and labor relations at the heart of that, as well as sustainability. And I think, I think that's really key if we want to engage any kind of science, any kind of technological innovation in a way that will lead to sustainable, equitable outcomes.
And Professor Lazaric, I was very curious, how does this relate to your research and more general to evolutionary political economy? And before going into that, could you give an overview of what exactly evolutionary political economy is for those unfamiliar?
Okay, thank you, Jan. First, let's summarize briefly. There is a willingness for evolutionary political economists to link and to bridge economics with politics. And this is the first objective. And why? Because there is, let's say, at a pragmatic point of view, there is we can see a kind of fragmentation of a landscapes between diverse stream of the schools, between Marxists from one side, post-Keynesian from another side, institutionalist, feminist, ecologic and néo-schumpétérienne economists from the other side. So I think it was super important and critical to reunify the heterodox voice and to make a conversation possible and doable between these diverse streams and to create some bridge between the diverse schools. So that was the first, let's say, objective of this evolutionary political economics. And also to develop a building block between these diverse insights, which are these diverse streams are very complementary. And if you unify, if you have create some bridge and some links between these diverse heterodox fields, you may have a richer picture for economic development, for evolution and socio-economic development. So this is that was the first, let's say, objective of evolutionary and also definition of evolutionary political economy. Think about if you are able to reconcile Veblen inside, Schumpeter inside, and Keynes to understand the economic, the evolution, the economic development, and without neglecting the dark side of innovation and policy making. So that could be really great. So this is, let's say, the objective of an evolutionary political economy. And just also, as evolutionary political economy, we have gone with a Schumpeterian vision in mind, let's say. And this Schumpeterian vision, let's say, it's an old image. It's really old. It's dated from the beginning of the 20th century. So it's time to change and to to really reshape our vision and our frame for this vision of entrepreneurial isolated man who is able to have some opportunity and to take risks and to make profits. So this is this kind of image as really dates and has also important outcome. And let me summarize this outcome because it's important, because what we have in mind has also some important implication. This vision of innovation is based from a man alone who is working alone and looking for opportunity. And it is this image also has for consequence to see innovation as in a way to push and to impose innovation for making profit. And of course, without taking into consideration negative externalities such as environmental issue and creative destructions. So, of course, this has very serious issue and also a top-down vision of innovation. This is important. And this top-down vision of innovation is always present if you look at beautiful romance, for instance, story about Silicon Valley. It's always very present in our collective way of seeing and observing innovation. And it was also for evolutionary political economists, it was time to think about some other image about innovation in political economics. And for instance, I would like to emphasize the important work of Mariana Mazzucato in her books, Entrepreneurial State, because she has really done a great work for debunking Silicon Valley myth and to reintroduce the place of the states in the debate, and for instance the role of a DARPA, the Defense Department Advanced Research Project Agency, for funding innovation. And without this public funds, collective innovation and entrepreneurs such as Steve Jobs could have not created these beautiful so-called innovations. So I think evolutionary political economy would like to re-emphasize the role, a new role, not a role of the state, a new role for the states. And for instance, I think if you think about actually the current debate about Green Deal policy, I think it's really a very nice opportunity for thinking about a new role of the states. An opportunity also to take into consideration more significantly of ecological innovation, which is not based on only one entrepreneur, but it's a collective process with unions, with many other actors, and not only the only entrepreneur, but consumer, union, and so many, and citizen, and also reinventing a new model of innovation with a bottom-up vision, which is totally different with a top-down vision of innovations. And also to think about a new role for a state for policy making, notably, for instance, for building commons, for new way of governance, and new way of include and to give more democracy within the innovation process. This is very important because if we assume a bottom-up vision, we should also include those people that are more that are really engaged and could benefit from the innovation. If you think about energy, if you think about fuel poverty, this democratic process of innovation is super important and is far to be neutral for designing and thinking and designing innovation. So I think it's really, let's say, evolutionary political economists would like to think about a new role for the states in this innovation process, and also a more inclusive way of doing innovation, and also a pragmatic way to thinking and to designing innovation with local actors, local solution in face of big issues such as poverty, such as environmental issues, such as inequality. There are big issues, but local solution, and also also pragmatic vision. You can encourage entrepreneur in a certain time, but do not forget SDG. SDG super important role for driving this innovation process at a long-term view. And this is important also to really reconcile these two sides of innovation. And I think this is this general framework of innovation which integrates social inclusion, ecological issue, and democracy within the innovation process, which is for us, super important for designing a new perspective for evolutionary political economy. So this is the program, some part of the program of this big agenda. Thank you, Ken.
I think it's really fascinating. I think, that is also the entrepreneurial state of
Okay.
It's also a very interesting book, I think, related to this. I see that Dr. Robert, related to your work, how does this relate to innovation systems in developing countries from a neo-schumpétérienne perspective? And I was also curious how it relates to the rise and fall of firms and industries.
Okay, thank you very much, Quinn, for inviting us to this interview sessions. I enjoyed very much the presentation of the other speakers. So I would like to say that neo-schumpétérienne evolutionary perspective focuses especially on dynamics of innovation system. As Professor Giovanni Dossi says, there are different strands in economics that can be recognized by the interested around two main concerns of economic theory. Those concerns are coordination on one hand and transformation and change on the other hand. Coordination refers basically how a society manage to make the decision process, the centralized decision process where there are division of labor, how they coordinate their labor and resources in this context. And this concern, the coordination concern, has been the main concern for neoclassical economics since marginalist revolution initiated by Shevons and Menger, and that it was later consolidated in one definition of economics that probably all of you know, that is Lionel Robbins' definition of 1930s, that it says, economics is a science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have an alternative use. So as you can see in this definition, establish what is relevant in economics, and it is mainly an allocation problem, which is mainly also an static problem. But economics should also be concerned for other main problem, which is transformation, which is change, which is how economic system evolves and how it transforms itself from within, as Schumpeter said. So classical economists, especially Smith and Marx, were very concerned about this issue, and although since marginalist revolution allocation problems replaced transformation problem, there were some other authors like Schumpeter that called our attention of this topic. So neo-schumpétérienne evolutionary economics is grounded in this long tradition that starts with Smith and continues also with Marx, Schumpeter, and other authors in along 20th century economic thought traditions. And although there are several branches among this neo-schumpétérienne evolutionism, there are three main epistemic principles or premise that can be seen as a common thread among all of them. And these premises are realism, non-reductionism, and open-ended dynamics. So by open-ended dynamics implies assuming that there are path dependence, assuming that change is key in understanding what happens in economic systems. Realism means break with an axiomatic theory that is not based in realistic assumption, and assuming that any formalization should rely upon a fructiferous dialogue with empirical facts. And non-reductionism implies to consider a break with any form of methodological individualism, where aggregated behavior emanates from linear aggregation of individual decision following behavioral rules based on rational choices. So there is an important point here that as long as we remain close to these three epistemic principles, we should we are getting closer to complexity theory, to emergent properties, to a continuous interaction between micro, macro, and meso and micro levels of analysis, and this is the epistemic and theoretical framework that evolutionary economics, evolutionary and néo-schumpétérienne economics have. And also it has a very serious implication on how to conceive the policy-making processes, because once that the idea of equilibrium is abandoned and for embracing an open-ended perspective, there is not possible thinking on optimal situation, neither market failures, neither policy neutrality. At this point, we have to see a lot of things that my colleagues in this session have already pointed at, that is a development planning policies. Development planning policies instead of fixing market or solving failures. So policy should not be aimed at fixing market failure, but guide dynamic system to societal goals, to solve societal problems. So I will stop here now.
Very interesting. And to come back to Dr. Daniels, how do you see the comments of your fellow panelists in here? And could you also expand a bit more on SDI policy in the context of disruptive technologies, AI and digitization in sub-Saharan Africa, or your research on state-led and grassroots in forms of innovation?
Okay, thank you. Very interesting insights and comments. This is very rich. I'm very pleased. First of all, the general work we've been doing is fortunately I'm in the midst of a economist here, so that's good. What innovation policy has been doing, or science and technology policy has been doing mostly in fostering in promoting R&D, has been to target not just to fix market failure, but shape market, but more importantly, to address economic dimension, economic goals. So the work we've been doing on the transformative innovation consortium within 12 countries now is to look at how do you use innovation and innovation policy to address not just economic concerns, but also social and environmental goals, as we see in the SDGs. So in a way, how do you really redirect or reframe or rethink or refocus innovation policy on the SDGs? Because by doing that, you're addressing economic goals, addressing social concerns at the same time, and environmental concern, which is very important. So this is the new thinking. We've been calling it the frame 3, because the approach in the beginning was just focusing on R&D. If you increase R&D, you get economic growth. And then we moved into the national systems of innovation thinking, where you need to address systems failure by making sure the actors are connected. It links to the point on actors, which I'll come into. But we see a case, South Africa, as we mentioned there, where the institutions have been built, the actors are there, many of the things that the NSI will say constitute innovation are there, but the learning, the linkages, the issues of directionality not being fixed. And then while they're still investing in increasing R&D, inequality is still growing. So you're doing innovation, but societal challenges are growing. Some of them are really at top, at alarming rate, So how do you, so in the version of innovation we've been using far up till now has not really focused on social and environmental issues. Even the economic growth thinking has not been spread in the way we thought it would trickle down. It's not been trickled down, which means inequality has been rising at astronomical rate, even though we have a lot of growth in some of the countries. So economic growth is happening. So there's a whole shift now, which connects to the point made on industrial policy. How do you really not just look at innovation policy, but also industrial policy, procurement policies, finance policies, bringing all these policies together and look at them beyond. So what are the components of, for us innovation thinkers or scholars, we know that procurement, for example, is one of the strongest innovation policy instruments, but if it's not used well, there is a problem, so, but how do you then use that to redirect that in a way that actually focuses on some of the social challenges? Some of the thinking you see from OECD and many of the big partners saying increase R&D, increase R&D, increase R&D to 2.5. Where do you bring these numbers from? We haven't seen really a very strong research that says if you go to 7% of R&D, inequality will be solved. No, we haven't seen that. So how do we then really not just use innovation to focus on economic growth, but use it to address the key challenge in a country, in a society, in a region? And then by doing that, economic growth happens at the same time. By focusing on a climate change, for example, economic growth can happen. So it brings into the point you're talking about on disruptive technology and AI. By focusing on inequality, where is the role of technology? How do we bring in how does technology need to be redirected or reshaped? Or digital, how do we need to reconstitute the way we do? We look at grassroots innovators. We've heard now looking at global challenges, but societal solutions. A lot of the societal solutions are at the grassroots level. How do you deal with that? But not just so it's not just the traditional model again of let's just increase economic growth, economic growth, and we hope it will trickle down. No, we've seen that that's not happening, or it's not happening at the rate issue, or at the scale, or at the dimension. Is not covering enough people, is not spreading. So bringing it back to Africa, we have countries where you have a 50, 70, ILO reports up to 96% in some countries of informal economy. Okay, but the traditional innovation focuses on actors and firms and formal economies and institutions. So how do you use innovation to target 90%? Because this is where the problem is. This is where 90% of the population operate. So if you just continue to do the innovation for the economic growth, you give incentives to tax credits to big firms, manufacturing big cars and doing all this stuff, and informal economy continues to grow, inequality continues to grow. So these are the kind of thinking we're doing. In that same vein, then you begin to think about, okay, if we're going to rethink the way we use innovation, not just to grow economic growth only by targeting economic growth, but focusing on top 3 challenge. If informal economy in Senegal, for example, is a big challenge and creating jobs for them, so how do we redo innovation? How do we rethink the way technology is applied? How do we rethink the way education is done? It's not just to do education in a way that is just so applying technology just to take the offline models to online may not be the way. Maybe we need to rethink the whole role of technology in higher education or lower education in a way that really addresses exclusion, gender, climate issues. So that brings the role of that. And so part of the, again, we see is in the way the actors' roles are changing. Actors have been mentioned. So I'm responding to your point, but also responding to the points my colleagues have made at the same time. We now begin to see some of the cases where funders are playing different roles now, as opposed to just giving money, so what is mentioned now is just about not just fixing a market, but also using funding now, the way funding is done for research, for innovation, for development, to create new markets, but also to shift actors into new behavior, to fund different things, to fund differently, to fund things that are more gender sensitive or inclusive or more climate focused or more SDG focused, as opposed to just funding research for research. So we see the different configuration. However, there is still tension in terms of people trying to learn, people trying to stick to what to what they've been doing before. Government roles is also changing. We've seen or encouraging or arguing for more grassroots actors to be done, but the studies on informal economy, there's a CESTI in South Africa is doing a lot of work on that, the Center for STI indicators on how do we actually measure or evaluate or estimate or whatever we call it, the role of innovation from informal economy. And now, because if we don't measure it well or understand it, how do we support it? You know, because that's where a lot of the jobs are. Even if not the jobs, that's where a lot of the problems are, the challenges are those sector level, but also those grassroots levels. So there is actors, there are big issues and the solutions. There's also the role of policies now beginning to change, not just to, as Verónica said, not just to fix market as traditionally market failure and the NSI frame 2, we call them approach, where we're trying to respond to, but also to create new sectors either in digital or in higher education or other areas. And also the nature of economies we want to create going forward. So there was some meeting we had this morning discussing how to harness innovation for sustainability, but also for resilience going forward post-COVID. So it's not just every innovation now that is also good. That has been discussed before, but also the nature of innovation, the focusing on product and process innovation in Africa, is that enough? Really, do we need to help understand how to expand the role of much more role for social innovation, organizational innovation, grassroots innovation. So digital is massive, is a whole area on that. There's some work we're doing on AI, disruptive technologies. There are issues around capability and capacity of Africans, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa or the wider Africa. There's some areas are very strong. Egypt has massive areas on infrastructure for digital, for nuclear. We have South Africa, as we mentioned, one of the most advanced research in astronomy is happening in South Africa as we speak now, the SKA project. However, in the same line, you see the dual economy nature, which has come up, where you have this high-end research happening, high-end university infrastructure, but also one of the highest inequality in the world, if not the highest. So, so how do you balance this, formal versus informal, high-tech versus low-tech? So there's digital happening, there's technology happening, but also unemployment is huge, inequality is huge, and the environmental issues are also being discussed because it's being based on mining, which is not very great, transitioning into that. So overarching policies are there in place to try to move the continent, as I started in the introduction, from resource intense, resource exporting, natural mineral resource into knowledge economy. It's been written, it's been discussed. However, that would take a while, and digital has a role to play. Capabilities have roles, retraining, rethinking education, but more importantly, the role of actors now has to change if we're going to achieve that, how we achieve that. So innovation policy is one, where they have innovation policy, but the understanding we're also trying to share is also not just focusing innovation as explicit policy, but also look at the role of implicit policies, or that policies that relate to innovation or have innovation components. I've talked about procurement policies, industrial policies, finance policies, and many other policies that you could actually use to redirect innovation or steer the economy into different direction, even though the innovation or STI policies are not so strong or not being massively implemented. So yes, I think that's okay now. For now, otherwise I go on.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Yeah, I think it also relates very interestingly to the work of Professor Newman, for instance, on what you mentioned at the beginning on inequality. How do you see that, and the other comments by Dr. Daniels?
Yeah, I think, there's a few things I'd like to say. First of all, what's been discussed in terms of policy here is still very much at the national level. So industrial policy occurs at the national level. We talk about national systems, etc. But I think it's really important also to understand the international dimension of the way in which sub-Saharan African economies, but all economies, are integrated into a global system. And as colleagues have already said, the importance of politics and power here also. So I think one thing we haven't spoken about is global value chains. And actually global value chains have both been heavily criticized as well as presented as some sort of panacea for, all you need are the right kinds of innovation policies, the right levels of education, and hey presto, integration into global value chains will somehow suck upwards all of the sort of lower tier suppliers up these chains towards greater innovation and higher levels of value added. There is now evidence, longer term evidence, to show that whilst there are examples where there has been successful upgrading, global value chain integration by developing countries has not brought about any kind of benefits of upgrading. But what they can do is create or reproduce old enclaves. So this is very, very much what we see in the continued commodity dependence in sub-Saharan Africa, but also we see it within sub-regional levels. So just look at how South Africa extends global value chains into the region. These are in foods, products, these are very much agro-food or around mining extraction, where there are potential linkages, technological linkages to be made, like in automotives. I mean, recent studies shown that there's abject failure, partly because of the nature of market power and the ability for certain firms or certain types of corporations to extract, both to extract profits via process of unequal exchange. And there's growing evidence to show that value chains in aggregate have increasingly been a conduit of the transmission of surplus from low-wage economies into the global north, with our own relationship with inequality that we're experiencing here as well. So, and I don't want to go on too long, but these are not accidental. I mean, the nature of inequality within countries are also heavily linked with the processes of outsourcing and the restructuring of industry in the global north, or the deindustrialization in the global north. So increasingly, this precarity that we're experiencing in the global north, the numbers of younger people who are losing jobs and finding it difficult to find permanent, secure employment, particularly in the nature of the context, that's much more tied and linked to the nature of underdevelopment or economic development and unemployment, underemployment in the global south. And I think global value chains is something we really need to think about very carefully and critically when we think about innovation policy as it links to economic development.
Professor Lazaric, to also come to another point with Dr. Daniels made, and we haven't really had a chance, we only got a bit into today, and that is one of the greatest challenges, I think, of the 21st century, of sustainability issues and climate change. So I was very curious, how do you see that in the context of the topics we discussed today?
Okay, let's say that, great challenges such as climate change, but also inequality, and the question and health issue, it's of course this is related to evolutionary political economy, and also it's linked to a new way to thinking about innovation. Let's say, for instance, if we think about environmental ecological innovation and climate change, we have also perhaps to go beyond, the first image of a Schumpeterian vision of one system that will be greener, that will replace an old system. And this vision is very technology push vision, and we should be more. And this is very present in issue about ecological transition. It's a systematic vision of innovation. Of course, we know that innovation are embedded in system, that there is a cluster level system vision, and that there is many externality which are and that innovation are progressing together. We know that innovation are interlinked with many other technical solutions, but let's say it's not reduced only to a technological vision. And there are many, when we walk about ecological transition in practice, what we see is that there are many locking, individual locking at, for instance, habits, consumer, green preference, social norms. There are the organizational level, organizational routines, coordination, new form of government, new form of cooperatives, new way of managing and building commons, for instance, and new institution, and think about new way of coordinating actors, public and privates, and institutional way of thinking and designing about innovation. And these three locking are all very important for going a step further than one technology that will replace another. That one technology that's supposed to be greener that will replace the old one. And this is, for instance, very present in many, in energy, in agriculture, in transport, because we think that our vision of systematic of innovation interlinked to the system was sufficient, but that's not sufficient, because otherwise we are not considering the organizational dimension, which is super important, the coordination, governance, and this is not to undermine the technological vision, but to say that there is the importance of technological vision, but linked to other dimension that's in order to have a richer image of what concretely, how we produce innovation, and how we produce innovation for having in mind an environmental issue. And this is very important. And also to have in mind that if we have an end in view, which is to reduce our environmental burden, we have to think about new way of doing things, to imagine new way of designing innovation, to include more, to have a more democratic way of thinking about innovation, and for instance also to scrutinize about what we call certainly curious place of new way of doing things, for instance, third place, which are new place for innovating, which are combining various way of doing and various vision for experimenting and finding new local solution in, for instance, urban agriculture and low carbon issue in terms of transport, and to find these places are also very unique for finding local solution to local problem. And this is very important because it's a focus on this third place and this place which are experimenting new way of doing things. There are also a spirit of doing innovation in a low-tech spirit. It's not always big technology which always solving a big issue. Sometimes small local solution that fit and that really are that are done according to local use, and this is very important. And this is also the let's say the lessons from reverse innovation debates. Means it's not this vision of innovation. We are not obliged to have a high-tech solution. Sometimes low-tech solutions are really enough in order to give appropriate solution to local problem. So we have always grand challenge and some local solution. And this is also, let's say, a shift and a new way of thinking about innovation with Ostrom in mind. Let's say also to have democracy, building commons, and to create and to manage commons. And for this, we need really to think about governance issues. For instance, this is done in cooperative, but also in third place, which are experimenting new solutions for local problem. And also to think about Dewey, about democracy, John Dewey about democracy, and also this bottom-up vision new way of doing things, and also Amartya Sen about capability, individual capability, because I think it's important to link Ostrom, Amartya Sen, in order to increase capability, to include people, and also to give a more sense, a purposive sense of collective innovation toward a direction of decrease the environmental burden and to provide a new way of doing things. So I think when we think about climate issue and big problems, we have always to have in mind, okay, what works in practice in which kind of context, and what can be done in this context, what can be replicated, readapt, and diffused in another context if there is a need for doing in this direction. And step by step, we should not think about big systems that will replace with big technology, perhaps for certain purpose, or for transport. There are need for thinking about big systems, but for some local solution, think about urban agriculture and fuel poverty. Sometimes local and low-tech solutions are doing well the job for this purpose. So at each time we're thinking about grand challenge, think about local solution in a pragmatic way. And we think about John Dewey, Ostrom, and Amartya Sen insight for going in this direction. That will be my message for this issue. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that we're already right on time, and I think that we then have to move to closing statements. If still possible for everyone, otherwise we, for Dr. Daniels, we always have the same question. I think it makes most sense to do it in the same order as we did the initial questions. We always have the same question. If there's one thing you could say to students in economics related to the topics discussed today, what will that be? And then first for Dr. Daniels.
One thing I would say is really the importance of learning. We're seeing many cases where lessons that should have been learned and implemented have not been taking place. So issues around policy learning is very, very important. Using Africa, for example, we've seen that the approach to policy making has not been working, but there's been a lot of resistance and regime actors refusing to change and learning how do we document learning, how do we capture learning, how do we encourage more learning and reflexivity, and how do we incorporate that in new policies, in new interventions, in new approaches happening. COVID is showing again a critical example that we know, as we mentioned, global value chains have not been very good. So many things have not been, but we didn't deal with some of these issues, and now we're here, and some systems are really now beginning to struggle. So it really, how do we learn? How do we learn at various levels? I wouldn't go into details of that, but just to say one word, policy learning will be a fantastic area to focus on, relating to climate change, relating to every of the points we've discussed. And colleagues, apologies, my next meeting I've started. I really don't almost never do that, but I'll need to leave, and I'm willing to engage more with all of you as well, individually. So thanks a lot.
And for you, Professor Newman, if there's one thing you could say to students in economics related topics discussed today, what would that be?
I think in economics, in all studies, but in economics in particular, there's a tendency towards abstraction. So really abstracting away from all sorts of things we've revealed as important here: history, institutions, context, and the like. So just to remember that underneath all of this, remember the actual living people and lived experiences. And I think that links to the policymaker as well. So policymakers also often forget about people except as people who experience the outcomes of policy. And I think in tune with what Professor Lazaric is saying now, just now, it's really important for policymakers to think about how policies can actually enhance not only the benefits of policy, but enhance the ability for people to participate democratically at all levels of economic activity.
Professor Lazaric, what will you be the one thing you'd like to say to students related to topics we discussed today?
Okay. Just a few words. Thinking about innovation as a collective process, as a possible democratic process, and thinking about innovation as, let's say, with environmental issue in mind, but for solving local problems for local use that can be really fit to local use. So I think this is the global message. We have very global challenge, but local solutions are super important. Think about innovation in a pragmatic way. This is the main message.
Professor Robert, what will be for you the very last statements for this session?
I think my colleagues said the things that I totally agree. Also, I would tell them that try to think out of mindsets that frequently emerge from mainstream centers. So they could found different voices, that different approaches to problems that needs very different approaches to be overcome.
I think it's a very interesting way to end today's session. Thank you each for your time. That was a very fascinating interview and I learned a lot. Thank you.